get yourself to talk into it.
Yeah. Here.
Okay. So let's talk a little bit about accessibility. All right. So obviously accessibility is an issue which has come up a lot. I've heard that word running around a lot around this conference, and for a good reason. So accessibility. So obviously accessibility has recently become more increasingly an important issue for our customers, and for a good reason, as well as various regulations. So yeah, it's become more and more important. And at IGeLU, we've learned that it's best to think about accessibility from the get-go. So going through the design stage and the development, we always think about accessibility as an integral part of the development process, right? And we think that's the best way to go about it, because if you're already developing and then you come back, you're going to have a bad time usually. And another thing about accessibility is that we believe that it makes the user experience better for all of the users, not only for those with impairments. So if your website is accessible, it usually means that it's arranged in a good way to give everyone a better user experience. So a few of the things that we look for when we're working on accessibility, all right? So we have informative area labels. We want to have correct row for various elements in the HTML. We want to be able to focus on the right element at the right time. So if we're opening a widget, obviously we want to be focused inside that widget and not still in the background somewhere, you know. And we want to have keyboard compatibility, which means you can basically get everywhere in the web page using your keyboard and be able to use everything. Correct DOM semantics, so heading structure, H1 for the main title, then going down H2 and so on. If we're using a list, for example, we want to use ULLI and not do something weird, right? And we want to have colors which are up to the standard. Right? So, okay. So when we're working on accessibility, obviously one of the things we need to do is work with a screen reader, right? And there's a few of them around there. There's JAWS, there's NVDA. We actually, well, our developers usually use NVDA when they're developing, and we also test in JAWS. We're doing regression tests and stuff like that in the QA, so using both of them to test. And when we're using a screen reader, we want to see that we have the correct description of the page content, and what's available for the user to click and do, all right? And we want to see that focusing on a certain element describes what it is and what it's doing, okay? So sometimes it's necessary to add area labels, which is basically text which the screen reader will read out once the element is focused, because if you have some button which is basically just some kind of, I don't know, X icon, and there's no text in it, the screen reader is not going to know what this thing does, so we need to add those area labels sometimes. Right. Okay, so each area of content should have the correct row attribute, so if it's a list or something like that, we want the screen reader to know this thing is a list, so we can tell you, okay, this is a list, this is the first item out of 10 items or whatever. Another thing is, especially when you're using Angular or something like that with a single page application, so a lot of the changes on the page are dynamic, right? We're not just using a static HTML page. So if we're pushing data to the user, we want to see that the screen reader is alerting him to those changes. So sometimes we might need to use area live attribute and create area live regions, all right? So we have to look into doing that sometimes. And we find that it's best to try and use simple HTML elements, all right, with the correct semantics, right, because it's called HTML for a reason, all right. So obviously, if you're making a list, don't disguise the list elements as a div or something like that, or if you have a link, use an anchor element there. Okay, keyboard navigation. So that's an important thing, obviously. So so the tab key should be able to cycle through all of the, let's say, actionable elements on the screen, all of the main elements on the screen. And opening sort of an internal window or a widget or something like that should lock the keyboard navigation inside it until he decides actively to leave it. So if we're in a widget and the guy hits tab, we don't want him to suddenly jump out of this widget and start going in the background or something like that, because obviously that's very confusing. And we can use the escape key or add a close button. And well, I don't have time. I wanted to show you some of those, but yep. All right, so sub-action. So if we have sort of like a drop-down list or something like that, so instead of having the tab key, having to cycle for all of them, usually we could use the arrow keys to go through the cycle for the different options and stuff. And the browser focus. So the main thing is that the user shouldn't feel lost, right? You should always sort of feel in control of where the focus is on the web page, right? And so we talked about opening internal windows. So we want to be, if we're opening some widget, we want to be focused straight away inside that widget. We don't want to stay in the background. And obviously, if we're closing it, we want to, let's say, go back to the element which created the action that opened this widget, right? So just to finish off, because we don't really have any time. So if you're taking anything away from this talk, a few golden rules. So we believe that accessibility makes the user experience better for all users, not only those with impairments. Shouldn't be done as an afterthought if it could be helped, because you'll have a better time about it and you'll have a better UI if you do it that way. And yeah, and try to keep it simple. Try using, just regular HTML elements and stuff like that. Don't try to do anything too weird. All right. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Now think of it as a fire drill now, and move out to the plenary session. If you have questions for Saul.